Today we will do something a little bit differently. Normally, I don't say over from other people. I try to say my own chidushim. However, today I'm going to tell you we're going to learn something very, very remarkable from a person, a rabbi, who lives in the Gush. Okay.
So last week you started off talking about how the Ramban was criticizing Avram for not standing up to the virtue of his wife.
Correct.
Sarah to Paro. Blah,
Correct.
blah. And that was her test.
His test, her test, both tests.
You said that she developed the laws and ideas of family purity and morality.
Right.
And she taught them to Avram.
Right. Where
did that come from? Because I had never heard that.
Okay,
it comes where did that idea come from?
It comes from when the angels come to bless Avraham and tell him that he's going to have a son from Sarah. The angel said, "Vayei Sarah ishtecha, where is your wife? V'hine Sarah ba'ohel." And Sarah was behind in the ohel. So what we learn from there is, Kol kavuda bas melech penima. The glory of the princess is inward. She doesn't flaunt herself in public. She doesn't come out to greet these guests because they did not know at that time they were angels. They thought, Avraham Avinu thought there were three schleppers who came down the road, and he ran out to them and he come wash your feet because he thought they had dust from their church or the Avodah Zarah place, and they were going to tramps it into his house, into his tent. So he washed their feet, indicating that he thought they were human and he thought they were of the Avodah Zarah. So, but Sarah does not come out to greet them, and when they ask where she is, they're told by Avraham, "Behine Sarah ba'ohel." Sarah doesn't come out and flaunt herself in front of strangers. She's remained behind, as we would say, behind the curtain. Okay, that's where we learn that from.
But is that a Hasidic?
No, that's in the Torah.
No, I understand the text is in the Torah, but then taking it a step further to saying that Sarah was the one that developed the law.
Well, that's right. And then you'll see, there's another source. When Avraham Avinu was on his way to Egypt, it says he discovers that Sarah is beautiful. What do you mean? He's been married to her for decades. Mm-hmm. The answer is that Sarah was a tznuah. She was extremely modest. Even to her husband, she did not reveal herself completely. Except, when you cohabitate, it's supposed to be in the dark. But anyway, that's the mitzvah. Anyway, so what we're saying here is that Sarah was a tznuah from the get-go. She was a person who felt that the inner beauty of a Jewish woman or a woman is not to be flaunted, it's to be protected, it's to be circumspect, and it's not to be in public display. Okay, so there are two sources for that, both psukim in the Torah.
And can I ask one other quick question?
Okay.
So we're also talking about the 4 kings and the 5 kings, and it says Avram took 318 people, his chanichav. The people that learned from him, his inner circle, the most learned Torah scholars.
Correct.
So in today's, and I'm not asking you to make an opinion on this, but in today's discussion,
should they arm the yeshiva bachrim and send them to the army?
Here's an example. Is this pasuk? I've heard other pasukim quoted on both sides for whether there should be an exemption for IDF. But what about this?
Okay, I'm not going to tell you that I'm going to paskin. I cannot paskin in the face of all these great people. But let's take it like this. When Ben Gurion gave the exemption to the yeshiva bachrim, it was on 2 premises. Number one, there were very few, and that he held orthodoxy was going to die out. So he let them have a bone. And he never thought it would, they would ever grow to these numbers. That's number one. Number two, it was in the aftermath of the Holocaust, when the great Torah centers of Europe were destroyed. So there was a need to have a revival. And in order to have a revival, he had to protect the integrity of the yeshiva bachrim, so therefore he exempted them from the army. Now that the numbers have grown to such an extent, that actually, maybe not today, but let's say in the next 20 years, it's going to become a threat to the Medina. Where are we going to get enough soldiers to man the fronts and to protect the people? Well, the Olam HaTorah believes that the Torah protects. And if need be, God will have to intervene somehow because the Torah will protect us. The halacha is clear. It depends if it's a Milchemes Harashus or a Milchemes Mitzvah. Is it a permissible war or is it a mandatory war of mitzvah? The Rambam defines what is a mandatory war of mitzvah. There are three categories. Category number one was the war to liberate Eretz Yisrael from the Canaanite nations. The Yeshiva Bachim didn't sit home. The Chemes Mitzvah, Hakol Yotzim. Everybody, every able-bodied person has to go out to the war. Afilu Chosan Michupasa. You take the Chosan standing under his chuppah and whisk him off to the battlefront. Vafilu Kala Michupasa. And even the Kala. She has to provide food. You know, the quartermasters. They have to stand behind the soldiers and provide them with their food, whatever else they may need. That's a Milchemes Mitzvah, category number one. Category number two, the battle against Amalek. That is a mitzvah war. Everybody has to go, same conditions. Category number three, Hatzar Habo Elecha, when we are attacked by an enemy. If the people of Israel are attacked by an enemy, the war is a mitzvah war to defend and destroy the enemy. So now we get to the question. Are we in a Milchemes Mitzvah? Is this country being attacked?
Yeah.
You can say it, you don't have to just nod it.
Yes.
We are
People
being
dying
attacked.
every week.
We are being
Innocent
attacked.
people.
Therefore, it's a Milchemes Mitzvah. Therefore, there should be an obligation to go to battle. So I once raised this with my Rabbi back 40-something years ago maybe. And he said to me, but they have to go to the battlefront, but they don't have to go into 2 years of training and 2.5 years of training. They can go to the battlefront. So I said to him, Rebbe, they go to the battlefront, they'll be mowed down like who knows what. They can't stand up. They don't know how to shoot. They don't know how to defend. They don't know how to attack. What do you mean you go to the battlefield? It didn't have a good answer. The truth of the matter is, there is no patur. If you want to look in the halacha, there is no patur. So what do the Gedolei Yisrael say? That the Torah is under attack. And if we don't protect the integrity of the yeshiva Avrum and keep them out of the army will corrupt them. There's women in the army. There's kashrus standards aren't so good in the army. And there's other problems in the army. The women sing, the women perform, the women this, the women that. All kinds of answers that this will erode the moral integrity of let's say, the yeshiva guys. And as a result, we can't allow them to go to the army. Which begs the next question. Why don't they, en masse, meaning all these gedolim, go to the army and say, listen here, if you want our boys to serve, set up separate units. Do not force them to attend a tekes where there's going to be women singing like the army does. Do all kinds of things. Improve the standard of kashrus. Improve the shmiras Shabbos in the army camps. Give them separate quarters, separate camps, separate everything, so that they can maintain their spiritual integrity. But they don't do that. Instead, they just sit back and say, since you don't have these standards, we don't have to go. Okay, so that's the big battle that's going on here now. And as I get the belt, that's what's happening. So now, let us pick up where we were really up to. We're in Parashat Lech Lecha. And let us begin again. Notice I take off my glasses when I read.
So you can see.
So I can see. Why do I want to see when I take off my glasses? Because I had cataract surgery, Baruch Hashem. I only need my glasses for distance.
I did the opposite.
Okay.
Cataract surgery.
I read so much, I just didn't.
Yeah.
Okay. Anyway, here we are. We are in Parashat Lech Lecha. We are on chapter 16, Tes Zayin. And it starts as follows. I'm going to read a little bit from the Chumash so we'll get a flavor of the context. V'sara yeshes Avram lo yolodo lo. And Sarah, the wife of Abraham, Avraham Avinu, did not bear him a son or a child. V'lo shivcha mitzris, and she had a shivcha, a maidservant who was originally from Egypt. Ushma Hagar, and her name was Hagar. Vatoma Sarah el Avram, and Sarah says to Avram, Hine no, atzarani Hashem miletis. God has held me back, blocked me from having a child. Bo'no el shivchasi, take my maidservant, consort with her. Ulai iboneh mimenu. Perhaps I will build a family from her. Her son will become my surrogate son, and as a result, I will have a family. I'll build for the future. I'll build from her her offspring. Vayishma Avram l'kol Sarai, and Abraham hearkened to the voice of his wife. Why? Because he too wanted to have a child. Vatikach Sarah yeshes Avram es Hagar hamitzvus, and Sarah, the wife of Avraham, takes Hagar, the Egyptian, Shivcha saw her maidservant, Mikei Eser Shonim Loshevas Avram be'eretz Canaan. After 10 years of dwelling in the land of Canaan, so now Avraham is 85. Vatite no so Avram, she gives him to Abraham, Avram, Isha, her husband, Loli Isha for a wife. Vayoval el Hagar, and Avraham consorts with Hagar. Vatar, and she becomes pregnant. Vatera ki harasa, and Hagar realizes that she's pregnant. Vatekal gevirta be'eineha, and her mistress becomes diminished in her eyes. Rashi explains what does this exactly mean. Well, it's very clear what it means, but Rashi gives a little bit more detail. Vatekal gevirta be'eineha, because what happened was as Hagar became pregnant from the first relationship. And Hagar said to herself at first, whoa, here it is, my master Avraham has married this woman, Sarah. He's been married to her for decades. They have not had a child. Me, the first time I sleep with him, I become pregnant. It must be that Sarah is not Tocha Kabara. She's not really what she makes herself out to be. She posits herself in her public image as being a righteous person. Everyone thinks she's righteous, but deep inside, in her heart, she's not righteous. Because if she was righteous, she would have become pregnant from Abraham, whereas I became pregnant. I am really a much purer soul than she is. So that's Vatekal Gevirta, the mistress. Her mistress became diminished in her eyes. Vatoma Sarah el Avraham. And then Sarah turns to Avram and she says, Chamasi alecha, my anger is against you. Anochi nasati shilchasi b'chekecha, I delivered my maidservant into your lap. Vatera ki harasa, she sees that she became pregnant. Ve'ekal be'ineh, and I became diminished in her eyes. V'yishpot Hashem be'ni u'v'necha, let God judge between me and you. Now what's problematic about that sentence? Whose idea was it for Avraham to take Hagar? Sarah. So what is Sarah saying to Avram? I'm angry at you. I gave you my maidservant, and now I'm diminished in her eyes. What is she talking about? Avram should have turned around and said, my dear, it was your idea. What are you blaming me? Why are you angry at me when it was your initiative that brought this about? But he doesn't say that. What does he say? Vatomar, he says to her, Vayomer Avraham, and Avram says, El Sarai, to Sarai, Hine shivchasech bideh, retake your maidservant into your hand. Behold, your maidservant is in your hand. Asi lo hatov be'inaya, do what you see fit in your eyes. Vataneha Sarai, and Sarah afflicted her. Vativrach miponeh, and she runs away. She cannot stand the affliction that Sarah heaped upon her once Abraham released her back to Sarah. Okay, we will go on with the story a little bit later from the context. I just want to deal with these points. She says, "Chamasi alecha," and she says, and then Abraham returns her to Sarah's jurisdiction, so to speak, and she afflicts Sarah. That's the lashon taneha. She pains her. She afflicts her. Now let's read what the Rishonim say about this. So the Radak, which is also in the Torah's Chaim, says as follows: Asilo atol b'nayich. He says, what did she do? He says that what she did was she heaped upon her huge amounts of work. Avodas parach. No, that's the term. Avodas parach. That's the terminology that's used by when Paro makes the Jewish people work. Avodas parach. Back-breaking work. So Sarah afflicted Hagar by imposing upon her or giving her back-breaking work, a tremendous load of work. And then he says she may even have yelled at her. And finally he says she may even have struck her. That's the affliction, that's the pain that Sarah heaped upon Hagar. The Ramban agrees with this. And he says as follows: Chata, after, he says, Chata imenu b'inu hazeh. Our mother Sarah sinned by afflicting Hagar in this manner. V'gam Avraham b'hinicho lasos kein. And don't think Avraham is exempt from the criticism of the Ramban. The Ramban says even Avraham sinned because he allowed Sarah to abuse, let's call it, Hagar. V'shoma Hashem elonyo, and God heard the cry out of the pain of Hagar. V'nosal lo ben, and he gave her a son. Sheyeh pera odom. He's going to be a wild man. Lanos zer Avram, and in this son, this Ishmael, the Muslims basically are going to afflict and pain the children, the seed of Avraham v'Sarah, b'chol minei ho'inu, in all kinds of affliction, which we are suffering from today. So the Radak and the Ramban indict Sarah. They accuse Sarah of acting improperly, not following in the midas of Avram Avinu of Chesed, and the Ramban goes so far as to blame both of them, both Avraham and Sarah. Now, today we have just indicted Sarah based on the teachings of the Radak and based on the teachings of the Ramban, and now we are called upon to defend their activity, their behavior. How do we defend this behavior?
Moving back even further, why offering Agar to Abraham isn't seen as a lack of emunah?
Why isn't what? That he took Hagar, why isn't that seen?
The Sarah offered Agar to Abraham. Isn't that also lack of emunah?
Well, it could very well be. As I said to you, I think last week, did I say this last week? Who remembers? We don't know exactly when, it's cold here, we don't know exactly when Avraham got married to Sarah. We know that when he was 75 and she was 65, they arrived in the land of Israel. We know that for 10 years in the land of Israel they had no children. That's how we know that they were 85. After 10 years of marriage, it says in the Pasuk, it's not a parish of a Midrash or anything. The Pasuk tells us that after 10 years of living together in Eretz Yisrael, or Eretz Canaan, they had no children.
So they didn't have a promise yet.
Right. What? No. Well, when did they get married? Well, let's assume they got married at 30. They're 30 years old. They're at least 85 now. That's 50-some years later. How many days can you pray to Hashem, please give me a child? And day after day after day, no response. How long can you maintain a fervor of prayer when you're faced with refusal to, there's no response from God for day. 50 years, you can't have an answer. You begin to lose your passion. Your prayer begins to wane. You begin to question yourself. Maybe I did something wrong. Maybe Hashem is angry at me. Maybe my prayer isn't fervent enough. Who knows what? But you begin to doubt what's going to happen. And even if you want to say that God promised children, there's a big klal. When Yaakov Avinu was running away from his brother Esav, he gets to Bethel, and he has this dream of the ladder, the angels going up and the angels coming down. And God tells him, if you walk in my ways, if you observe my mitzvahs, I will return you safely to your father's home. Do not be afraid to go to the house of Lavan, for I, God, will return you safely to your father's home. That is the dream, the nevuah that Yaakov has at that famous dream of the ladder. Now, Yaakov's on his way home. Esav is coming to greet him with 400 men. Vayira Yaakov ma'od, and Yaakov was very afraid. So Rashi says to him, what's going on here? Why is he afraid? He had a safe passage promise from God. He doesn't have to worry about Esav. Hashem promised him a safe return to his father's home. He's not home yet. He's on the way home. So why is he afraid of his brother? Says Rashi, Shema mishihiftach, perhaps from the moment that you promised me, back then when I was a young man running away, nislachachti b'chet, I muddled and dirtied myself with sin. In the intervening years I may have sinned, and if so, the promise of God will become vitiated, it will become erased. It will no longer hold, because there is an implied condition. When Hashem promises something, you have to remain righteous. Hashem doesn't promise you and then you can turn your back on him and decide to become a sinner and then say, oh God, you promised me. Hashem's promises are conditional on that you being raw, you being fit for the promise. So even if we say that Sarah received a promise and Avraham received a promise of children, 50 years of no response creates doubt in your mind. Maybe I did something wrong. Shema mishi hiftachtani, maybe from the moment you promised me, lislachachti, I became contaminated, dirtied with sin, and then the promise becomes batel, the promise becomes negated. Anyway, how did we get into this? Okay, so we're back to here. What happens here? So Avraham and Sarah are indicted. Now let's begin the defense. There's you've all heard of Mishlei, the parables of Shlomo HaMelech. Shlomo HaMelech has a very interesting sentence in which it says as follows in Mishlei. Tachas shalosh rogza ha'aretz. Because of three things the earth shudders, meaning it's intolerable to the earth. These three things are very troublesome to the existence of the world. Number one, avatachas arba lo suchal seis. But the fourth wrong, the world cannot tolerate. It's so bad you can't tolerate it. Now he's going to tell us what are these four things. Number one, tachas eved ki yimloch, when a slave becomes king. The power goes to his head. He's used to being a slave. He can't deal with the authority and the responsibility and the power of king, and therefore it ruins his sovereignty, it corrupts him, it destroys him, and this is one of the terrible things that happens sometimes in history. A slave becomes the ruler. Number two, v'naval ki yisba lechem, and a neighbor, a person who's a lowlife, all of a sudden becomes wealthy. He becomes wealthy. He's a lowlife. He's a little cheat. He sits, who knows what he does. He pickpockets, whatever he does. And all of a sudden he becomes wealthy. He doesn't know how to use his wealth. The nouveau riche, he becomes rich, and he corrupts. His wealth corrupts him. He can't handle it. That's one of the things that disturbs the tranquility of the world. The third thing, tachas nua kisiboel, when a man marries a woman that he does not love. When that happens, there's no peace in the household. He will tear at her and she will tear at him. And there's no peace. When there's no peace, you can't properly raise children. You can't live a life of simcha. You can't live a life of productivity because you're constantly fighting with this woman who you married because you didn't love her. Why did you marry her? Maybe you married her for her money. Maybe you married her for her cover, her position. She was an aristocratic woman from a very hush of a family. Whatever it is, when you marry and you don't have love, that is the third worst thing that the world has, that the world suffers. What's the worst? Says Shmuel, says Mishlei, Shlomo. Tachas arba lo tuchal seis, and this fourth thing, which is the worst, the world cannot bear it. What is that? Betachas shivcha kisirash gevirta. When a slave surpasses her mistress. So let's understand what that means. What happens here? Hagar is a slave, a maidservant. Sarah wants to raise through her a surrogate son. So she gives her to Avram Avinu as a surrogate wife. Now she becomes pregnant and she becomes uppity. She begins to think she's a superior person than Sarah. She has more internal spirituality, more internal integrity, honesty, whatever, kindness. And therefore she turns on her mistress and she begins to complain and say that she is superior. We'll see soon what the Rabbeinu Hananel says here, because his pshat is unbelievable. But Shivcha kisirash gevirta, when the maidservant thinks she's superior than the mistress, that is the most unbelievable, destructive force that could possibly happen. And that's what Hagar did. So Hagar did two things. Number one, she became arrogant, that she was the favorite, that she was more spiritually prominent and on a higher level than Sarah, but that's why she became pregnant, whereas Sarah did not. And second of all, she sought to bypass Sarah and assert, I provide an heir to the master, I am the favored wife. I am no longer a second level wife, I'm superior to the primary mistress. I'm going to supplant her. I'm going to be the primary mistress of this household because I produced an heir to the master. So, not only did she arrogantly think she was better than Sarah, but she stabs Sarah in the back. Sarah provides her with this golden opportunity to bear a son to Avram Avinu, and instead of appreciating the opportunity that was given to her, she sought to supplant Sarah. She stabbed Sarah in the back. So we're beginning to understand a little bit the psychology that governs Sarah's behavior, but it goes further. Let's read Rabbeinu Hananel. Rabbeinu Hananel is brought in the Toras Chaim of Mikros Gedolos. If you know what a Mikros Gedolos is? It's an anthology of Perushim on the Torah. And it was produced in the Middle Ages, not too long after the invention of the printing press. Some Jewish people got together and they decided to make a chumash with Rashi, and they put the Orachayim, or they put other Meforshim into this Mikros Gedolos, and they called it Mikros Gedolos. Mikra meaning the Torah, Gedolos, it's big now, we've expanded the Perushim to the Torah. Now in the traditional Mikros Gedolos, there were many Perushim, especially from Rishonim, that were not put in because they didn't know that texts existed in the Vatican or in the Chves, in the British Museum, or in other places where they stole manuscripts from the Jews and they hoarded them there until modernity, when they began to open up their archives. So among the things that was discovered was a parish of Rav Saji Gaon on the Chumash, Rav Saji Gaon going back to 900s or whatever. There was Rabbeinu Hananel, who was shortly after the Rav Saji Gaon. He was one of the Gaonim, before the Rishonim, before the early commentators. So Rabbeinu Hananel's parish was discovered subsequently to the publication of the Mikros Gedolos, and the Maram, and the Radak. All these perushim are not in the traditional Mikros Gedolos because the manuscripts that were verified as to be their perushim were not known to the publishers of the original Mikros Gedolos. Anyway, along comes Mosada Rav Kook, and they publish a Mikros Gedolos, which they call Toras Chaim, the living Torah. It's like a little bit of a thing. We've inserted life into the Torah, Mikros Gedolos, and they put Rabbeinu Hananel, the Rav Saji Gaon, the Maram, the Radak, All of these Perushim and the Chizkuni and the Sefarno, all of these are not in the traditional Mikros Gedolos, but they're in the Torah's Chaim. By the way, the Torah's Chaim doesn't have the Orach Chaim HaKadosh, because he's an Achron, he's a much later commentator. They only have, in the Torah's Chaim, only Rishonim or Gaonim, from earlier periods. Anyway, in the Torah's Chaim, you will find Rabbeinu Hananel. Rabbeinu Hananel was, again, like I said, maybe in the year 1000, maybe about the year 1000. Anyway, Batomar Sarai el Avram Chamasi Alecha. Now he's going to go on this issue of how could Sarah accuse Avraham and say, I'm angry at you because of what happened here with Hagar. After all, it was Sarah's idea. It was her thought that Avram should take Hagar. So how can she yell at Avram or say, I'm angry at you, Avraham, because of what's going on? Says Rabbeinu Hananel. The Inyan Chamos, this matter of anger, ki Sarah hoisa mishabedes b'Hagar. Sarah treated Hagar as her maidservant. V'hoisa kafufa elaha, and she was subservient to Sarah. She had to help her get dressed, maybe. Now, maybe she probably could dress herself, but maybe help her in the kitchen, do all the kinds of domestic chores. However, Avram said to Sarah, Ki avon plili lanosa. It's not right that I should sleep with Hagar, in a sense treating her like at least a concubine, but even maybe more so as a wife. I should treat her as a wife, and you should make her a servant. You should impose servant duties on her, not harsh duties, but make the beds. Not harsh duties, servant duties. You are going to treat her like a servant, and I'm supposed to treat her like a wife somehow. That's a oxymoron. That does not work. Umona atzma milishtavid ba, and he prevented Sarah from using her as a maidservant. Va'atanis amra. Now Sarah says, you see what happened? You gave her a finger and she took a hand. You treated her somewhat, beneficially, but as a result of that, she now became uppity. She stabbed me in the back. Bial ke nombra. That's why Sarah said, Yishpod, let God judge between me and you. Who was right? Should I have continued to use her as a maidservant, or should I have listened to you and free her from all domestic duties? And that's what Sarah said to Avram. You said I should free her from all domestic duties. You gave her that finger. She took a hand, and now she thinks she's superior to me. And that's why Avraham was attacked by Sarah when Sarah said, Chamasi Alecha. It's your doing, Avram. Of course I said you should consort with her, but I never meant for you to elevate her to an equal status with me. You elevated her to an equal status with me, and now she thinks she surpassed me. And that's because you gave her a finger and she took a hand. Okay. By the way, says the Rabbeinu Hananel, we'll see soon, further, that when the angel, Hagar runs away and she stays by a be'er. She goes to a be'er. We'll read this in a few minutes in the text itself. But at the be'er, she sitting there crying, and an angel appears to her and tells her, what are you doing here, maid servant of Sarah? So the Rabbeinu Hananel says, you see that the Malach, when he comes and appears to Hagar, of course his purpose is to talk her into going back to the house of Abraham, to Avram. But as he addresses her, he calls her the maidservant of Hagar, of Sarah. So you see that the Malach is saying to Hagar, your true status is to be a maidservant of Sarah's. Avraham raised you to the level of a wife, but that was a mistake. Anyway.
Supporting Sarah.
Right. He undermined Sarah. Ultimately, she stabbed Sarah in the back. Okay, we'll see soon. This is going to be a very big problem, and according to Rabbeinu Hananel, it's answered. Okay, what we're going to see, Rabbeinu Hananel basically is taking the position that Hagar stabbed Sarah in the back. Hagar became uppity, thought she surpasses Sarah, and as a result, Sarah was correct in restoring her to her submissive status because she was very improper. She behaved very improperly towards Sarah. And remember what Mishlei said, when a maidservant thinks that she surpasses her mistress, this is an intolerable situation. It creates animosity and hatred and jealousy and destructive behavior. Okay. Now,
permitted it.
excuse me?
Avrum permitted it.
And yes, that's what the Ramban accuses Avraham of doing. Now Avraham says, okay, Sarah, you're right. Take her back as a maidservant and do as you would like. Whatever you like to do to her. And then the pasuk says, Vata'aneha Sarah, and Sarah afflicted her. Now this becomes another indictment. This became an indictment of Sarah. Why would Sarah be abusive to her? Why would she treat her cruelly? So,
How does this affect the mindset of Ishmael?
well, we're not up to that yet. We'll see soon. We'll see. We're going to get to that. Now, Rabbeinu Hanana also has a very interesting insight. He says he disagrees with the Radak. He disagrees with the Ramban. Of course, he preceded both of them, so they disagreed with him. He says, you know what it means that Sarah afflicted her? It doesn't mean that Sarah abused her in any way. It doesn't mean that she was cruel to her. It does not mean that she cursed her or beat her or dumped heavy-duty work on her. It means Sarah took away the taste of freedom that she had. She once thought that she was equal to Sarah because Avraham allowed that. But once Avraham said, take her back as a maidservant, the taste of freedom was taken from her mouth. In other words, what was the affliction to Hagar? Nothing abusive, not physical, not mental. The only thing that was, what was the affliction to Hagar? That she was no longer considered a free woman. She was now returned as a maidservant. She had to make the beds and wash the dishes and do menial things that a domestic servant does. But that she was abused? No way, says Rabbeinu Hanano. She was not abused. She was just the freedom that she had, that brief moment of freedom, not moment, but months or whatever it was of freedom, were taken away from her. And that's what it means that Sarah afflicted her. Afflicted her by taking away the taste of freedom, the status of freedom that she had for those months. Now what's very interesting is another discussion. A discussion of what is the status of Avraham Avinu. Well, let me just let's go a little further before we get back to that next issue. Now Hagar runs away. And she goes and she sits down by a well. Vayimtza Malach Hashem al ein hamayim, and the angel of God finds Hagar sitting by a stream of water, a spring, not a stream, a spring. Bamidbar, in the desert, al ayin b'derech shur, by the spring on the way to shur. It was probably a stop. Howard Johnson's might have been there. Vayoma Hagar, and Hagar says, Vayomar, the angel says, Vayomar, the angel says, Hagar, Shivcha Sarah. Hagar, the maidservant of Sarah. Amy Zebas, from where are you coming? Where are you going? You're sitting here in the desert. You're sitting by a spring of water. Where are you going? What are you doing? You don't have a plan. Do you know where you're doing? First of all, you know where you're coming from. You're coming from the house of Avram Avinu. And where are you going to go? Anywhere else, it's going to be a step down. Vatomer, and Hagar says, B'pnei Sarai gevirti anochi barachas. You know why I'm here? I ran away from Sarah, my mistress. Anochi, I ran away. Vayomer lo malach Hashem, and the malach says, Shuvi el gevirtech. Go back home. Go back to your maidservant. V'hisani tachas yada, and be afflicted under her hand. So now, if you understand that the angel has met up with Hagar at this spring of water, what's the purpose of the angel? To convince Hagar to return back to the house of Avram Avinu. Do you think that the angel would have opened up his conversation by saying, go back to Sarah, be our maidservant, and let her afflict you? Let her suffer under her hand. V'hisani tachas yodeh, and suffer under her hand. Would that be a good opening argument? Would that be something to convince Hagar, who ran away because she was abused according to the Radak and the Ramban, and tell her, listen, go back to Sarah and be abused further? You think that would be a good opening statement? If if you want to convince Hagar to go back home, nicht sie klieg. You know what that means? Not too smart. The angel is obviously smart. So he tells her, go back to Hisani. According to Rabbeinu Hanano, where there was no abuse, he's telling her, go back and be a maidservant to Sarah, because Sarah is a tzaddikus. Sarah is a righteous woman. The house of Avraham is unparalleled. Even today it's unparalleled. Certainly in the ancient pagan idolatrous world it was unparalleled. Go back into the spiritual cove, into the spiritual cave, into the house of Avraham Avinu. V'hisani tachas yodeha, and be subservient to her. Lose your taste of freedom. Vayomer lo malach Hashem. And then the malach Hashem says to her again, Harbo arbe ezarech. I'm going to multiply, speaking in the name of God, obviously. He says to her, I, God, I'm going to multiply your children. V'lo yisafer mirov. You'll have so many children, they'll be uncountable. There'll be millions upon hundreds of millions of Muslims. Vayomer lo malach Hashem, and the malach Hashem says to her a third time, Hino chara, behold, you are pregnant. V'yoladet bein, and you will bear a son. V'karas shemo Yishmael, and you will call him Yishmael. Kishoma Hashem Elohim, because God heard your cry of pain. Who yeh per adam, he'll be a wild man. Yodo bakol, his hands will be against everyone. V'yad kol bo, and everyone will be against him. V'al penei kol echav yishkon, but he will dwell on the face of these enemies. He will surmount them. He will conquer them. He will subdue them. And then Hagar gets up and she goes back. She goes back to the house of Avraham Avinu, and she becomes a maidservant once again to Sarah. And we will pick up the story when she's finally driven out of the home, which is in the subsequent parsha, and we will have to deal with that too. But right now we're dealing with the first time she runs away from home. Now, if you noticed, as I said, as I was reading, there are 3 sentences in sequence. Each one starts with the words Vayomer lo malach Hashem, and the angel of God said to her. Now, if I'm in the middle of speaking to you, and it's a prolonged conversation, does it have to say every few minutes Vayomer lo, that I'm speaking to you? Vayomer lo, I'm speaking to you? Of course you're speaking to me. This is all one conversation. It's an extended conversation. Why does the Torah tell us Vayomer lo, Vayomer lo, Vayomer lo? 3 times he says to her. He says to her once, go back. He says to her a second time, go back, and God will multiply your children. And he says to her a third time, you'll have a son named Yishmael, and he'll be a wild man, and he will ultimately prevail. Say the Mefarshim, and this is a very good parish, that each time the Malach spoke, he expected Hagar to listen. He's speaking in the name of God. He tells her, go back to your maid, go back to Sarah and return to your submissive status as her maidservant. Does Hagar get up and go back? No. 9. She stays put. She doesn't budge. She doesn't respond. She's not moved by this message from God to return. She's stubborn. She sits in there. She refuses to budge. He says to her again, oh, you're going to be rewarded with multiple children, so many they won't be able to be counted. Does she get up and return? No. She stays put. She doesn't move. Third thing he says to her. In other words, there's a pause between each statement, because the Malach expects her to listen to God and get up and go home. But she refuses. The third statement he tells her is, you will have a son, Yishmael, and he will achieve freedom. He will not be subservient to Avraham. He will not be subservient to Yitzchak. He will not be subservient to Yaakov and the children of Israel. He's going to be wild, a free spirit. He's going to roam the deserts. He's going to be a Lawrence of Arabia. He is not going to be subdued. He's going to have, his hand is going to ultimately prevail. Then says Hagar, you mean my son will not be a servant? He will not be a servant to the children of Israel? He will be somehow free of that burden? Then she goes home. She hears from Hashem that she will have Yishmael, who will be a free spirit, a wild person. She then goes home, because now she realizes that her suffering and her ability to stay in the house of Avraham and submit to the authority of Sarah will have an ultimate reward, that her son will be a free man, untamable, unconquerable, and therefore she goes home. Okay. So that's the end of the story of Hagar's running away from home. We have defended Sarah. Sarah did not abuse her. Sarah just took away that taste of freedom that she had for that short period of time with the approval of Avraham to restore her to subservient domestic service to Sarah. Now we are going to come to an amazing, amazing thing. Okay, let's get back, let's return to what I started to say. I interrupted myself. But now let's get back to the issue here. Avraham, we consider Avraham Ivri. Avraham is on one side of the world, and the rest of the world, the idolatrous pagan world, is on the other side. But Avraham, we consider him to be the first Jew. He's the first one that Hashem spoke to in a way that he said, I know, God testifies about my servant Avraham. I know of him that he will instruct his children and his household after him to follow in the ways of God. He will do righteousness and he will do justice. He will be the first one that will spread the faith, that will spread the belief in one God. Now we know from our Midrash that Shem and Aver had a yeshiva, and they too were believers in one God, and Shem taught the observance of the Zion mitzvahs, the 7 mitzvahs. So why does God select Abraham over Shem? Why does he select Avraham to be the progenitor of the Jewish people? Why didn't he choose Shem and Aver? They had a yeshiva. Answer. That is given because the pasuk says about Avraham Avinu, "V'hu heichel likro ba'aretz." He went out and proselytized. He went out and spread the word that there's one God. He went, again, as we said previously, from town to town, from village to village, engaging the populace, confronting them, debating them, persuading them to believe in one God. And the Torah tells us, Es hanefesh asher asa b'chara. The men, the women, Avraham megayeres ha'anoshim, Sarah megayeres es hanoshim. Avraham convinced the men to believe in one God, and Sarah convinced the women. So there was a tremendous effect that Avraham had. He was spreading the word, as we might say, and had positive results. Shem ve'aver resided in their ivory tower. They did not go out. The pasuk does not say that, hey, Shem ve'aver hechilu likro ba'aretz, that they went out to spread the word. They stayed behind. They looked at the world and they said, "Oh, this is a world of pagan idolaters. It's a futile effort to go out and try to talk to them." And so they remained in their ivory tower. Therefore, they were not the progenitors, or they're not given credit as being the progenitors of the creators of Am Yisrael. Avraham Avinu is given that credit. Now, Avraham Avinu then we consider to be the first Jew, let's call it. But the Torah wasn't giving it. You know, at the foot of Har Sinai, Moshe Rabbeinu was Magayer, the whole nation. And that was the Nasa B'Nishma. When they accepted to follow the mitzvahs of the Torah, even unheard, Moshe Rabbeinu then brought a korban and was Koreis Bris. He entered into a covenant with the Jewish people that the Jewish people, we, the Jewish people, will accept the Torah upon ourselves, and therefore that we were converted in a sense. Hashem Hemircha Lo La'am, God announced that He would be your God. The Jewish people, announced that they accept Hashem and they accept His sovereignty and His Torah and His mitzvahs, etc. Nasa v'nishma. We will do and we will listen. So there was a gerus. So really, before Matan Torah, although we call Avraham Ha'ivri the first Jew, he was really also a ben Noach. He was a son of Noach, which means what? That means he had to observe the 7 Noahide laws. Because that was the laws that were given to Adam 6 and then Noach 7th. Hashem ultimately gives an 8th one to Avram, to have a bris milah. But Avraham was a ben Noach, and he had to observe the 7 mitzvahs b'nei Noach. One of the 7 mitzvahs b'nei Noach is the mitzvah of dinim, the mitzvah to set up a civil court system that will enforce the laws. There's a difference of opinion between the Rambam and the Ramban, between Maimonides and Nachmanides. The Rambam says that the obligation to set up a system of courts is to enforce the other 6 of the 7 Noahide laws. The Ramban says, no. It's much more pervasive. It's much more expansive. It means to set up a civil law that can govern society, that can keep us all from each other's throats, from each other's pockets, and therefore we are told, do not steal, do not commit adultery, do not blaspheme God's name, do not be cruel to animals, set up a system of courts, etc., the 7 Noahide laws. And the Ramban says, included in the mitzvah of dinim is not just dinim based din, a court system, ela dinim laws. And the civil laws of the Torah really are adopted, must be adopted by the Gentile world. That means the Gentile world has to produce a code of law. Okay, so if Avraham Avinu is a ben Noach, he must observe the code of law that was promulgated in his time. Now, I think I spoke to you before about an opinion that was offered by Rabbi Yosher Ber Soloveitchik of blessed memory and Rabbi Yaakov Weinberg, my Rosh Yeshiva of blessed memory. Both of them said when the Torah says Vayhi b'mei Amrophel, when it was in the days of Amrophel, who is this Amrophel? Hammurabi. So I told you when I first heard this, I said, oh, come on, get real. What do you mean it's Hammurabi? Where do you get from Amrophel to Hammurabi? But if you look up, as I said before, you look up Hammurabi on the internet, you will see that we are mispronouncing his name. His name is not Hammurabi with an H, it's Amurapi with an Aleph with an A. Amurapi. That was his real name. So if his real name is Amurapi, there's only one letter that distinguishes Amrophel from Amurapi, and that's the Lamed at the end versus a Yud at the end. So now we are very close. When it says Amrophel, it could be Amurapi instead of Pil. So it's one letter off. That's not a big thing when you're talking about a cross reference of one language to another, from Akkadian to Hebrew. One letter off is that's dead center. So anyway, Amurapi was Amrophel, which means what? That means that Hammurabi, who instituted his code, the code of Hammurabi, lived in the same time as Avraham Avinu. They were alive at the same time, and if we believe what Rav Weinberg and Rav Soloveitchik said, that Amrophel was Hammurabi, they crossed paths. And they fought against each other. So now, but Avraham Avinu is bound by this code, because he's a ben Noach. So now comes an interesting thing. What does the code of Hammurabi have to say about what we're talking about? So listen to this unbelievable thing. Now when I read this in a sefer called Iyunim beParshas HaShavua, Insights into the Parshas HaShavua, by a person named Elchanan Samid. It's really Harav Elchanan Samid. He's modest. He doesn't put his title on the cover of his book. It's Harav Elchanan Samid, who is a Rav in the Gush. He lives in the Gush. And he is, in my humble opinion, the most profound and brilliant of the Parshanim that emerged from the Gush. Now when I say this, it's not a simple thing. The Gush has an emphasis on Torah Shebiksav. In the Gush, meaning, you know what the Gush is, I don't have to explain what the Gush is. The Gush, there is a tremendous emphasis on studying the Torah Shebiksav. Rav Kook already bemoaned the fact that in the European yeshivas, they stopped learning Tanakh. They barely learned Parshas HaShavua. They learned it with Rashi. Very few learn the Ramban. Hardly anyone, if anyone, learns the Radak and the Rabbeinu Hananel, Rabbeinu Sajigon. They just don't know it. They don't know these things in the yeshiva world because their emphasis is on Talmud and Halacha. But in the Gush, they spend a considerable amount of time studying the Torah Shebitzav. They study the Tanakh in the yeshiva. It's not even on the curriculum. There's no yeshiva that has a curriculum to teach Tanakh. In the Gush, there's a heavy emphasis on Tanakh. Anyway, the great Parshanim, the great expositors of the Torah Shebiksav, all live in the Gush. They're either Talmidim of Rabbi Tzvi Yehuda Kook, who's a Talmud of Rabbi Avram Yitzchak HaKohen Kook, or they're Talmidim of Rabbi Mital, who's a Talmud of Rabbi Tzvi Yehuda, or of Rabbi Aaron Lichtenstein, who also is a blend, who learned also the Torah of Rav Kook and also the Torah of Rav Soloveitchik, his father-in-law. Anyway, in the Gush, they are great expositors of the Torah. So, Rabbi Samad, I tell you, I think is the most brilliant of the brilliant. And he says, he quotes as follows, he quotes a Targum, a translation of the Code of Hammurabi, by a man whose name is Moshe Weinfeld, and his translation of the code appears in Olam HaTanakh, the world of the Tanakh. And he gives you the page number. And this is how Rav Weinfeld, Moshe Weinfeld, translates the Code of Hammurabi, which was written in Akkadian, which was translated into English, and then Moshe Weinfeld translated it. I'm not sure if he translated it from Akkadian, maybe he did know that language, but he translated it probably from English, and this is his English translation. What's great about his English translation is the Gentile who translated the Code of Hammurabi into English did not know the nuance of the halacha, did not know the nuance of the Tanakh like Moshe Weinfeld knew. So his translation is not only more accurate, but it is also more profound and has greater connection to our Torah. Anyway, this is how he translates law number 146 through 147. These are the law, the code that was translated. Each law was given a number in the Code of Hammurabi. So now we're going to read the translation of law number 146 through 147. And this is what it says. Ki yikach odam isha kohenes, when a man takes a priestess for a wife. Now a priestess served the pagan god and did not have children. She'eino rishos l'ledes banim. He adds this, Moshe Weinfeld, to explain to us why it tells you a man takes a priestess wife. You know, a man takes a wife. What's with the priestess part? Says Rav Weinfeld, he tells you, because she was not permitted to have children. She was a priestess to this Avodah Zarah, whatever it was, and she wasn't permitted to have a child. V'hi titein le'isha alma, and she gives her husband a maidservant. She has a maidservant, and she wants to have a surrogate family. So she gives her maidservant to her husband to produce a child. Aim Talid Bonim, the mother that she gives, the maidservant that she gives, if the maidservant that she gives to her husband bears him a child or children, came to Shava Atzma, and then she becomes uppity and thinks she's equal to the mistress because now she has produced an heir for the master, whereas the primary mistress cannot have children. The mistress is not permitted to sell her. Why would the mistress want to sell her? To get rid of her out of the household. She's not permitted to sell her. Why? Because she bore children to the master. Vizu achzorius, and it will be cruel to separate her from her children. So therefore, the mistress, who's upset that the maidservant now thinks she surpassed the mistress and she's equal to her, so she can't sell her. Oh, what can she do? He tasimo leha os. She can mark her. She can brand her to make sure she realizes that she's a maidservant and not equal to the primary mistress. Vitimna osa beina almos, and she now counts her and puts her down amongst the maidservants. She now restores her to domestic duties. Im lo tele banim. What happens if this maidservant did not bear any children? And she becomes, thinks that now that she's consorting with the master, she has some level of freedom and equality. Tite nosa bekesa, the primary mistress can sell her for money and get rid of her out of the household. So now let's go back to the story. Sarah is barren. She has no children. She takes Hagar and gives her to the master. The master consorts with Hagar and bears children. Now the maidservant thinks she's equal to the mistress. What's the code of Hammurabi say? Demote her, brand her even, put her back into the status of a maidservant, let her serve like all the other maidservants. You cannot separate her from her son because that would be cruel, and therefore she cannot be sold off. You have to tolerate her presence, but you demote her and put her down and restore her to her maidservant status so she no longer can consider herself equal to the mistress. And if she didn't bear any children, then sell her. Exactly what Avraham and Sarah do. They followed the code. They were bound by the code. They followed the code to the letter. It could be even, if Rabbeinu Hananel knew this, which he did not know the code of Hammurabi, he might have said that maybe Sarah branded her. Because the code says you can brand her, you can put a mark on her. You can do something that will make it physically obvious when you look at her that she's not a free woman. And that's exactly what the code provided, and that's exactly what Avram and Sarah did in fulfillment of the code which they were bound by, because they were B'nai Noach, and they had to keep the Zion mitzvahs B'nai Noach, and the code of Hammurabi was part of the 7 mitzvahs B'nai Noach. Tam v'nishlam, the defense of Sarah. And by the way, according to the Ramban, the defense of Avram Avinu Gamken.
She did everything perfect, and they indicted her.
Right, but they didn't know the code. They didn't know, probably they may not even have known of Rabbeinu Hananel. They may not, they knew who he was because he also wrote Responsa, and he was a great Gaon in the academy of the Gaonim, but they may not have known about his Perush on Chumash. They may not have known. It's very, very possible. It wasn't discovered until centuries later. So they may not have known Rabbeinu Hananel. Had they known Rabbeinu Hananel, maybe they would have adopted his position. But the point is, after learning Rabbeinu Hananel, after learning Mishlei to talk to us about how terrible such a betrayal is, a stab in the back, and then we understand from Rabbeinu Hananel and from the code that they followed the letter of the law, we have defended Avraham and Sarah. Thank you for listening.